Okay, so here we are on the last afternoon, and we're all giving up some pleasant weather and sunshine to sort of kind of find out how miserable we are really doing in the world again. So the last time that we met in Kolkata, the World Conference on Public Health, this thing we call neoliberal globalization was still very much in full force. It was dominated by the austerity agenda that followed the 2008 global financial crisis. And we had massive U.S. regional trade and investment deals that were in negotiation or near finalization. There was little movement on climate change, and wealth inequalities were worsening. So fast forward 3 years. 2015 saw adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and a new climate change agenda. 2016 saw the International Monetary Fund question whether neoliberalism had been oversold, an overdue response without apologies, and how the economic policies had helped to promote worldwide for the previous 30 or 40 years had worsened inequalities while also failing to stimulate growth. Even the wealthy elites at the annual World Economic Forums in Davos, Switzerland, were beginning to worry publicly about the state of inequalities. So is the world taking a slow U-turn towards a more just, locally grounded, and environmentally sustainable future? Good question. And the answer is not so much. The world continues to get hotter every year, and wealth inequalities are getting worse. Now, Oxfam began to draw attention to this with its Even It Up campaign, noting that originally in 2010 that 388 billionaires had as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. But in 2014, when they really got off the ground, they calculated it at 85. But it's kind of an odd thing, but billionaires get really tetchy if you underestimate the extent of their wealth. Just look at poor Donald Trump right now complaining to Forbes magazine that knocked him back to just $3 billion in wealth, saying, I have a lot much more than that. So when they recalculated the numbers then, Forbes said it was only 67 people. But by 2016, it was only 62 people. And of course, we know in 2017, it's now dropped to just 8 people. And meanwhile, since the 2010 data crunching began, the top 62 people, going back to 2016, they managed to absorb 44% of the wealth gains, while the bottom 3.5 billion lost 41% in terms of the wealth gains. So a bit of a correlation there. The top 1% of these uber elites, simply put, now control more wealth and the privilege and power, which is the really important thing about the wealth they contribute or they control. They control more wealth, power, and privilege than the bottom 99% of us. 2016 also saw the UK choose to Brexit by the slimmest of voting margins with a campaign that was full of lies, the alternative facts that have become now the facts of the current era. But of course, the biggest shock was the November 2016 election in the United States. Now, I know that we're all tired of hearing about the Donald, okay? But in point of fact, if you think we're tired now, just wait until 4 years from now. So we're just going to have to keep contending with this guy. Now, Trump's election, I think, has thrown a fairly large political spanner into globalization's economic machinery, at least with the threatened protectionism and prompt withdrawal from the mega trade and investment treaties. But whether this means that the U.S. will abandon neoliberalism's underlying tenets really remains to be seen, and I kind of doubt that it will. Powerful American transnational corporations have built their wealth upon neoliberalism's market openness and hyper-mobile capital, including some of Trump's own businesses. And running the government as a business where people become consumers rather than citizens is actually totally coherent with neoliberalism's fundamental principles or theory. The Trump administration as well, and most of the Republican Party, are not anti-trade. They just want the trade rules to be much more favorable towards American multinational interests, as if they're not already. But more immediately troubling, as we've seen, is the Trump administration's climate change denialism, Islamophobia, antagonism to Mexico, abandonment of women's reproductive rights, deregulatory agenda, and the gutting of all U.S. spending except for the military and homeland security. It's important to acknowledge, I think, that not all of those who voted for Trump or who supported other world leaders exhibiting similar autocratic tendencies necessarily agree with all of their leaders' economic or social policies. And I think a lot of us were quite warmed by the huge protests that met Trump's inauguration and that appear to be continuing and also encouraging to witness and support. I attended the Women's March the day after the Trump inauguration when I was in Toronto. And it was the largest march that Toronto had experienced, that Ontario had experienced in over 20 years, with roughly 100,000 people on the streets. It also had a great poster that an older woman was carrying that basically said, "I can't believe I still have to protest this shit." Which is a reminder that we've been here before, and persistence is now increasingly essential. But I think what's also needed is the articulation of a new global policy platform to challenge this exclusionary violence and othering of the rise in right-wing populism, one that speaks more rationally but also emotively to the human need for caring and sharing and to the ecological urgency of sustainability. And so enter the SDGs. So we have 17 SDGs and 169 targets. We know they were probably developed in the most inclusive global process undertaken. And I think they can provide part of such a platform, but they have to definitely undergo some serious political tweaking. At their headline level, the actual statement of the goals themselves, they hit most of the important health or social determinants of health buttons. But the proverbial devil is in the details, the targets and their measures on which public health advocates will need to push their respective political decision makers. So let's look at goal 1, for example, which is now more ambitious than the previous MDG poverty goal, but it's hardly ambitious enough. It's based on the World Bank metric of $1.90 per capita per day in consumption, while the lowest estimate of what should be considered a meaningful poverty line is $5 per capita per day in consumption, a rate that's rapidly rising and below which 4 billion people struggle each and every day. And using this poverty level, and based on current poverty reduction trends, the world would wake up January 1st, 2030, with much of the population still poor, including over 90% of the population in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's one reason why the SDG 10 on reducing inequalities is so important, although there has to be a lot of pressure on distribution. For example, it's one thing for this goal to have a target of sustained income growth for the bottom 40% at a rate greater than the national average, but quite another to target measures that would reduce the distortion of accumulating wealth at the top, without which inequalities would continue to rise. And there are really only two ways under capitalist systems, at least that I'm aware of, that we've developed so far, to really tackle those inequalities. And that's reducing market income inequalities through labor markets. In this instance, that more of the economic product that is generated goes to labor than to capital. And the second is through post-market income transfers and extensive social protection spending to close the gap all along the gradients of inequality. And the first is achieved through strong labor bargaining rights and more equitable pre-distribution of income. The second through progressive taxation and provision of low or no-cost public goods essential for healthy lives. And under neoliberal economics, we've been failing miserably on both. So the global labor share of economic wealth has been sliding downwards ever since the spread of neoliberal economics in the 1980s. And yes, there's been an emerging middle class in some previously low-income countries, such as China and India, but within-country income inequalities are skyrocketing in most of these developing countries that have seen some of the benefits of the past 40 years of economic integration. And these benefits has also given at the cost of the industrialized working class in countries like the US and gave rise to this phenomenon now called the precariat, the insecure, underemployed, multiple job holding, no benefits receiving, low wage sectors which characterize now most employment in previously high income countries. And the rather simple fact is that we could say we now have a global economy where there are too many workers producing too many goods or providing too many services for too few consumers, borrowing against real estate bubbles and the future of their grandchildren to finance what they do buy. and hence the importance of the second means of reducing wealth inequalities, progressive taxation. In many countries, we've seen huge drops in the top and marginal rates on the wealthy, increases in regressive consumption taxes that mostly hurt the poor, decreases in corporate taxation, and almost complete failure to close tax havens, and little action to slow the hugely increased and highly speculative financialization of the economy that contributed to nearly bringing the entire world economy to its knees in 2008. Now, most of the public health advocacy work that we'll have to do around these two things, about the labor markets and about the redistribution, is really about the stronger, not weaker, collective bargaining rights, greater job sharing, more public measures to ensure full employment, and the decent work agenda as the ILO describes it, and equity-oriented tax measures that are needed to redistribute wealth and fund meaningful public sector work, including perhaps the push to a rather now controversial or contentious move to try to create universal basic income. So most of the public health advocacy around that kind of agenda is going to occur within national borders and needs to occur within national borders. As Miranda will emphasize on taxation especially, that's really where it has to start. But I think we also require forging links among like-minded countries that are willing to push back against the downward competition in taxes that we are still living with. So that's the global agenda. We have this hypermobile capital and this downward pressure on taxes. And this particular graph, basically, I monetized world economic product and looked at, from World Bank data, what was actually captured by taxation. So in 2004, about $28 billion sort of remained in people's pockets that were untaxed for any kind of public purposes. In 2012, this had more than doubled to $58 billion. I'm not suggesting that we tax everything and just have the one great state, but do the 1% really need that much wealth? That is entirely a rhetorical question. Now, given the need to dampen speculative derivative markets and arbitrage gambling that chased microsecond profits for no useful purpose except accumulating more capital, a financial transaction on global currency exchanges, and this has been estimated at 5 cents on every $100, that it could generate over $8 trillion a year on revenue. And that's more than enough to finance all 17 SDGs and their 169 targets. That doesn't mean that this is going to be accomplished. It's more a polemical device to basically say, we have the resources and we have the means. If the European Union finally gets its act together around doing it domestically, we might actually begin to see more countries join in on something about a financial transaction tax. So there may be some hopefulness for something like this to occur eventually. But so far, the US, and certainly not under Trump, the UK, certainly not under Brexit, and you big-time players like China and India are opposed to such a tax. But the European countries who do follow through with that are close to implementing more broadly for the Eurozone, and it could create this bit of a norm cascade. Now, finally, we have the life-threatening age of the Anthropocene. We cannot grow incomes for the poor using our consumption-based capitalist economic model, full stop, since doing so would require, at present consumption levels, not taking into account future consumption levels, 4 planets of Earth. Unfortunately, we only have the one. So I think the SDG 12, which references the importance of sustainable consumption, should actually really be inverted, that we need to consume sustainably within ecological limits and not overshoot what our environment can provide us. So I want to then take these 17 goals and 169 targets and basically condense them into just 3, as saying that this is a platform, I think, that we could begin to advance at national and at global scales. So the first is reduce inequality, goal number 10. Because in itself, if we succeeded, this would eliminate poverty. And we would do that through regulations and policies that would see labor gaining disproportionately more than capital, and progressive taxation reforms at the national and global scales. We also need, as I said, to consume and produce sustainably. And that's going to require more equitable global patterns in both, alongside aggregate reductions which underpin all of the environmental SDGs, again through nationally enforced regulations and policies. And then a third that I haven't talked about yet. And this is ensuring quality education for women and girls. And that's not to exclude the same for boys or for men, but emphasizing women and girls, given the state of low and middle income countries, can rapidly advance gender empowerment. And that's one of the best known means to improve health equity. Now, of course, that's much easier to say than it is to do, but it is in our efforts to do, whether we succeed or not, that we find both our hope and our humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron, for that very, I think, challenging introduction to the issues. Challenging because it's sometimes a bit difficult to get to grips with understanding some of this, but it's also challenging because it asks us, our own societies, to change to some extent. Anyway. So we'll take just a few minutes of questions of Ron just on his talk, not the larger issues. We'll come back to that as part of a general discussion. But for those who want to ask questions or queries or comments briefly, you've got now a little bit of an opportunity to do so, bearing in mind a later discussion. There are standing mics down at the bottom of each of these stairs. So if you could come down and just briefly say your name and talk. So, any takers here?
Ruth Carris from ANU. Just a quick question. You were talking about the goal of reducing changing the tax distribution, and I'm just wondering if anyone's looked at a systems perspective to see what the feedback is in terms of how vested interests would stop that from happening.
Well, very briefly, is that it's going to be a huge uphill battle to continue pushing against that particular outcome. The inequality, because in taking a very close look at all of the targets and then also all of the indicators for the targets, what you find with the SDGs is there's a continuous watering down of what the actual import of those headline SDGs are, just the actual statement, kind of reduce inequalities. So there are examples that run all the way through. And that's because politically there were many countries that, okay, we'll sign up on it, but we've got to make sure that they're not going to be too terribly threatening. So I think that for public health, what you do is you go back to the headline goals. You look at a few of the targets that are sitting in there, and if they're inadequate, and I would say a number of those targets are inadequate, you push for stronger targets. So it's like keep the vision part of the advocacy going. Don't get caught up in the minutiae.
Right, any other comments? Yes?
Yeah, I'll come back to Peter Sainsbury's question and ask it a different way. So, is there a form of capitalism in which those three goals will be achieved?
There has to be.
I think that's a question that social scientists, political scientists, kind of lefty-oriented sort of like theorists have been asking for 250 years without an answer. So we don't know.
David, do you know?
I believe that
Don't obfuscate.
I've forgotten the guy. What's Mao's second in charge was called? Chou En-lai was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too early to say.